As Europe emerged from its centuries-long struggle to avoid slipping into complete anarchy, age-old questions once again began to come to the fore. Spurred mostly by a desire to understand humanity's relationship to its Creator, the priests and monks of the Church Universal worked to preserve what they could of the ancient understandings of astronomy. Though much was lost, the core idea of a creation constructed from spheres remained, even as the mechanics of such a thing were a mystery. It was only through the translations, first of Islamic texts and then, eventually, Greek manuscripts, that a fuller and more comprehensive picture began to emerge. Yet so complex was the astronomical model of the universe bequeathed by the Greek scholar Ptolemy that it would take a century for the scholastic natural philosophers to finally understand it well enough to not only use it, but to improve, refine, and eventually critique it. Yet as this process was occurring, a disaster unfolded not only in Europe, but across the known world, killing millions. A plague born on the steppes of Central Asia, it would first ravage the Mongol kingdoms of China and Hindu realms of India. Yet even as reports of eastern cities filled with death reached the shores of Europe along the Silk Road, the plague began its inexorable movement west to the Black Sea. It would be here that it would find its way aboard the merchant vessels of European traders and jump to the ports of Italy and France. For many in Europe, it seemed to come out of nowhere, a wave of disease that crept over the land and crawled along the coastline from port to port. In the southern part of the continent, it was absolutely devastating, killing 80% of the population by some accounts, while further north, where settlements were more isolated and cities were smaller, the death tolls were a less staggering, but still mind-boggling 20 to 30%. Those who lived in cities, crowded and teeming with vermin of all sort, there the blow fell especially hard, with mortality rates uniformly exceeding 40%. For the 4 years between 1347 and 1350, the Black Death ravaged the population of Europe just as it did those of the Middle East and North Africa, just as it had done earlier in China, India, and the Central Asian steppes. But unlike the similar devastation wrought by the plague of Justinian some 8 centuries earlier, this catastrophe did not send Europe back into a civilizational tailspin. This time, the institutions were stronger and more resilient. While war continued to be an all too common reality of European life, something that continued even through the chaos wrought by the plague, there were now stable political systems and religious institutions. The Catholic Church was a deeply rooted steadying force that not only brought regularity to the lives of its faithful, but that also began to restrain the excesses and brutality of fighting that had raged over Europe, even as it perpetuated its own atrocities overseas in the Middle East through a series of crusades. Throughout Europe, small feudal fiefdoms began to coalesce into larger and more rationally run entities that could more effectively and fairly maintain infrastructure and administer justice. However, it was in the universities that the knowledge so hard won was preserved. Even as death reigned in Europe for half a decade, and the specter of plague would be an ever-present shadow over the lives of many for the next 3 centuries, the scholastics of Europe continued to train new students, ask new questions, and arrive at new conclusions. And as this process of inquiry produced new ideas, those products of reason found a culture fundamentally changed and willing to go in new directions and try new things. Within 2 centuries of the plague's arrival, there was no European institution that had not been transformed by the upheaval wrought by the disease. Feudalism was finished in the West. The church was divided, and the cosmos was turned on its head by a man who sought to restore a universe built out of uniformly turning spheres. To understand how this last change came about, we have to examine how it was that the European mind went from barely grasping the motions of the heaven to mastering their most intricate details. This narrative will take us from the halls of the University of Paris to the streets of Nuremberg, where a man from King's Mountain would bring astronomy to the precipice of revolution. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 12, Restoring Astronomy at the End of the Middle Ages. So here we are, at the historical dividing line of the Great Mortality, the Black Death, the Plague, whatever you might call it. While not necessarily deadlier than any earlier plagues in Western history, it looms large in our collective mind because we have the greatest record of it. Coming as it did during the European Renaissance that began in the 12th century and was gaining speed, so to speak, during the 13th and 14th centuries, there were many who were able to document its horror. Some did so in writing, others in art. But the record they have left is one of unimaginable misery, suffering, and above all, death. It came at a time of great progress in the cultural life of Europe, with the establishment of the great universities, scholasticism, and the expansion of trade across the Mediterranean. In our last episode, we talked about the intellectual flowering that took place in the 12th and 13th centuries as the texts of Aristotle were finally made available to Latin Christian scholars, first to understand and then to critique. We focused on the subject of physics at the end of the episode as a way to understand how that process worked and recognize that even as Aristotle was held by many to be quote-unquote the philosopher, there were many of those who recognized that his physics contained unsupportable ideas in need of modification. However, in astronomy, as we will see, the picture was significantly less clear. Unlike in physics, where there were neither significant modifications that had been made to Aristotle, nor alternative models to challenge his descriptions, astronomy offered a very different picture. As you will recall from our earlier episodes in this series, there had been two models one can consider. The first model, coming from the Hellenic period of late classical Greece, was based on the spheres of Eudoxus and had been expanded upon by Callippus and Aristotle. It offered a cosmos that worked hand in hand with Aristotle's physics as an integrated description. In it, physics and astronomy were combined to form a self-consistent cosmology. The second, developed throughout the Hellenistic Greco-Roman period, was most completely summarized in the works of the Alexandrian Claudius Ptolemaeus, or Ptolemy. This model broke with that of Aristotle in that the Earth was not the center of all circular motion. It did not agree with the celestial physics of its time, but rather was developed with the purpose of best modeling the actual motions of the planets in the heavens. As these two models were reintroduced to the natural philosophers of Europe, there wasn't a clear consensus to work from. No supremacy of Aristotle to first master and then question. For this reason, the process of their incorporation into the picture promoted by the institutions of the time was more complicated and uneven. However, alongside these changes in natural philosophy, it should be understood that they took place, especially from the 14th century onwards, in a cultural context that was undergoing an even more extraordinarily dramatic change. It is here again that I might be said to adopt an unconventional historical position. In my view, the Great Mortality, or Black Death as it is often referred to, provided a catalyst that allowed the forces that had, in the 1200s, remained under the surface to come to the fore and produce a stunning level of disruption to many of the institutions of Europe. In my mind, the plague of 1347 creates the conditions that allowed the 12th century Renaissance to go from something that was working to raise the standard of living in Southern Europe to a force that would transform nearly every aspect of life in Europe. As you likely know, the first two waves of the plague, the first lasting from 1347 to 1350, and the second occurring from around 1360 to 1361 or 62, killed between 30 and 50% of the population of Europe. As you might imagine, good estimates are a little hard to come by, as only a few of the governmental institutions were keeping good records at this time. But it is absolutely clear that this event, for about a decade and a half, was the dominant reality in the European mind. No institution was able to provide any sort of meaningful solution to the waves of death that swept across Europe. No government, church, or guild was able to stem the ever-mounting piles of bodies, and I believe that this seeming helplessness to stop what was the most horrific thing anyone could imagine fundamentally undermined many of the survivors' faith and trust in those institutions. This would be exacerbated by the beginning of the 100 Years' War between England and France and the growing divide within the Catholic Church as to who would lead its faithful and control its resources, especially as the Crusades both failed and were revealed to be enterprises that fell far short of the lofty rhetoric that had been used to justify them. Once the plague as a broad epidemic had ended, those significant local outbreaks would crop up over and over again for the next 4 centuries. The landscape of Europe, both physically and socially, had fundamentally changed. The place of the church was undermined, something made clear with the Western Schism of 1378, when there were, for a time, 3 popes. In England, the first vernacular translations of the Bible would be produced to allow parishioners deprived of clergy to access the Holy Scriptures, a development that would presage the broader movement away from centralized church authority. This turmoil would also open the door for political figures to acquire more power and for dissent to bubble up to the surface more frequently. The plague also broke the foundations of the feudal system, as the reduced population and the iron law of wages led to peasants demanding more rights and larger political entities consolidating power from local lords and fiefdoms that could do little to provide for the needs of their people. As labor became and continued to be more scarce and thus more expensive, there was a greater interest in labor-saving technologies. From this would arise more and better water-powered sawmills, paper mills, and grist mills. Nothing would more profoundly represent this rise of technology, both in its ingenuity and its ability to fundamentally alter the culture, than Gutenberg's movable type printing press, first made operational in 1439. In Italy, the preeminence of land as the sole means and measure of wealth was challenged by the rise of the Medici family and its banking empire. This shift away from the centrality of property ownership further eroded the hold of landowners and what they had in terms of the development and innovation, especially as the once fertile lands reverted to wilderness, as there were no longer enough hands to cultivate them. Additionally, due to its greater fluidity, the reintroduction of money promoted enterprises that were inherently less conservative and reactionary than those supported by the landed nobility that had dominated Europe for the last 8 centuries. With this came an increase of trade that was built on the routes of the Crusades and the rise of a powerful merchant class. This came to be best represented with the gains made by Henry the Navigator and the fleets of Portugal. Also, accelerating a process begun in the 12th century, the political forces associated with Christianity began to consolidate and come into conflict with the political forces associated with Islam. In the East, the rising Ottoman Empire extinguished the last vestiges of the Roman Empire with the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. From this point, the Ottoman Turks would advance into Europe proper through a conquest of Greece and the Balkans. Perhaps nothing would do more to turbocharge the 15th century's Italian Renaissance than the influx of scholars from Constantinople and Greece in the years leading up to and immediately after the city's fall. As they streamed into Christian Europe, they brought with them the original Greek works that had, for so long, been accessible only through Islamic translations. Moreover, they added entirely new intellectual currents to the universities of Europe, something that would only further the process of inquiry. Another outcome of Constantinople's fall was that it forced the Christian political entities in the West to focus on working together instead of fighting each other, something that would begin to lead to greater consolidation and cooperation. Thus, 1453 would also mark the end of the 100 Years' War and the establishment of a France that looks recognizable today under a single French ruler. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Reconquista finally brought together most of the various kingdoms of Spain through the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, and expelled the Emirate of Granada in 1492, thus creating a fourth nation-state that could marshal significant resources towards its goals. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it is in this year that Columbus would, to put it kindly, stumble across the New World, thereby massively expanding the scope of the European mind. All of this would set the stage for the momentous upheavals of the 16th century, ones that would usher in the modern world. Within 30 years, Machiavelli would write The Prince, Luther would post his 95 Theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg, and a little-known Fraconian lawyer would publish a document that suggested that the Earth was not the center of creation, but merely another planet tracing a path around the sun. But now, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Before we move forward, let's take a quick look back to remind ourselves where things stood in the area of astronomy in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. Coming out of the Islamic Golden Age were a number of important documents. Along with the Almagest, there were a number of summaries of and commentaries on that work. Some of these, as we'll discuss, called into question a number of Ptolemy's devices, something that the European scholars would find very, very interesting. Along with these were produced two other important pieces of scientific literature. When combined together, they were known in Arabic as a Zij. The first of these were basically star catalogs, much like those Hipparchus and Ptolemy had produced in the Hellenistic period, but with additional data for new locations or, as time went on, updates to the positions of the stars on the celestial sphere in order to take precession into account. The other type of documents that were produced were tables of predicted positions of the planets for various dates. These were calculated using Ptolemy's model, first by the astronomer himself in a document known as the Handy Tables, and then by other later scholars. For the development of European science, the most important of these were known as the Toledan Tables, compiled in Spain by a number of Islamic and Jewish scholars and put into their final form around 1080. This is the point at which the translation movement in Latin Europe really begins in earnest. As we discussed in an earlier episode, much of this was driven by Gerard of Cremona's desire to translate the Almagest into Latin. During his lifetime, he translates over 70 works, including Alfragani's Elements of Astronomy, a non-mathematical summary of Ptolemaic astronomy, and the work of a scholar by the name of Peurbach, titled On the Motion of the Eighth Sphere, that became the foundation of the early astronomy curriculum in the quadrivium. For a European academy not yet up to the task of understanding the complex mathematical models of Ptolemy's Almagest, these served as something of a bridge that expanded the basic features of the models without getting too far into the weeds. Now, before we shift completely into European astronomy, let me say just a couple more things about astronomy in the parts of the Muslim world still producing new work. While the once great cities of the Middle East, such as Baghdad, had been more or less annihilated by the Mongol invasions, there were still astronomers working around the edges. In the 13th century, in Moraga, Al-Tusi produced a significantly improved Zij, as well as a revision of the Ptolemaic model that could produce retrograde motion without resorting to all of the devices that Ptolemy had included. In the 14th century, an astronomer, Ibn al-Shatir, was able to develop a mathematically consistent model that completely eliminated Ptolemy's equant. As we will see, this development will look identical to something that would also be done by Copernicus much later, though no historian has been able to find a direct link between the two. As these works made their way into Europe, they were often seen as being truly arcane. The reasons for this perception are varied, but a lot of it undoubtedly has to do with the advanced state of mathematics in the Islamic tradition. These documents would have used both Hindu-Arabic numbers and Al-Khwarizmi's algebra, along with significant advances in trigonometry, all of which, to use a common phrase today, was light years ahead of anything in Latin Europe at the time. Therefore, before the nuts and bolts of the astronomical models could be understood, a scholar would have to learn an entirely new way of doing mathematics in entirely new notational format. Given the occasional superstition found in those outside the scholastic academic tradition, it's no surprise, really, that these would sometimes be assigned sinister meanings and connotations, especially during the plague years when anything and everything that was out of the ordinary was suspected to be a cause of the disease in some way. One of the things that's kind of interesting, our modern designation of a field or branch of knowledge as being associated with pagan influences or witchcraft is known as being occult. And that term actually comes from the use of planetary tables to determine when one celestial object would move in front of another. For example, when the moon might move in front of Jupiter. This astronomical event was, and still is, called an occultation. And in this time, it was thought to have both what we would think of as astronomical and mystical meaning, and thus have a real effect in the real physical world. We know today, of course, that this isn't the case, but in a time when the forces of nature were not well understood, it was understandably thought that changes in the heavens were tied to changes on the earth. As an example of this, I think we've mentioned this in the past too. One of the stories in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales involves a magician/astrologer who is said to use the Toledan tables to calculate the motions of the heavens to predict and foretell events here on earth. In the line of Chaucer's poem are a number of technical details about how various astronomical, or probably better stated, astrological quantities were calculated. It's clear from these details that Chaucer is familiar with the elements of both Ptolemy's model and some of the geometry used to make calculations from it. It's at this point that we can begin to speak of the work of academics in the scholastic tradition that begin to push things forward. The individual who was perhaps most important in beginning the process of moving the European scholars to a point where they could access this information was a man most often known by the Latinized form of his name, Johannes de Sacrobosco. He was an English scholar from the region around Holywood, hence his Latinized name, who was trained at Oxford and then taught at the University of Paris. There are three works of his that are important for our discussion. The first was in Astronomy and published around 1230. The Tractatus de Sphera, or the Spheres for short, was an introduction to Ptolemaic astronomy that lacked much in the way of mathematical explanation, but did adequately cover most of the important features of the model for those who found the Almagest too difficult to work with. It was really kind of an improvement over some earlier things. As it served as an accessible introduction to the subject, it would remain popular for centuries, even though it contained several flaws and errors. The second work of his, Algorithmus, served as an introduction to Hindu-Arabic numbers and their use. It was instrumental in getting the numbers and operations into the quadrivium so that students of mathematics after about 1235 would begin to see the advantage of these new symbols and what they offered over the use of the Latin system of trying to use letters to do arithmetic. Finally, he published a criticism of the Julian calendar called De Anni Ratione that correctly pointed out the problems with the Julian calendar and suggested corrections. While somewhat unnoticed at the time, this work would become the foundation of later efforts to reform the Western calendar, something we discussed in our first episode in our short series on the history of telling time. Later in the 13th century, a work known as Theorica Planetarium, or model/theory of the spheres, was written. Unfortunately, we don't know who wrote the original manuscript, but it corrected a number of flaws of Sacrobosco's work, and thus became a standard part of the astronomy curriculum, along with the somewhat older work. Some historians actually trace the core of the manuscript back to Gerard of Cremona himself, but the evidence for this is disputed. The next big step was the publication of what are known as the Alphonsine Tables, so named for King Alfonso X of Castile, under whose patronage they were created. While we don't have the original Spanish version of these tables, we know that they were being circulated around the University of Paris by 1320. These would become the standard set of planetary tables for the next several centuries, with updating of parameters as needed based on your position or the year. Unfortunately, even as late as this, most European astronomers had no idea how the tables had been produced. Modern scholars have shown that the values would have been created using Ptolemy's model from the Alchemist, but we don't know who it was that actually did the work. There is an amusing quote, however, by the king related to these tables. While it is not known whether he was enough of a scholar to have participated in their actual development, he certainly appreciated the complexity of the Ptolemaic model and the difficult work using it required, and thus is said to have opined, quote, "If the Lord Almighty had consulted me before embarking upon creation, I should have recommended something simpler." End quote. Thus, on the eve of the plague, the state of astronomy in Europe was still far behind the work being done in the last fragments of the old Islamic world. In the universities, only a fraction of the astronomers understood things well enough to actually use the tables being produced. An even smaller fraction, just a tiny portion really, understood the tables well enough to be able to use them to make observation or to create redesigns of them in order to make them easier to use, or were able to modify them for use at new latitudes. No one understood the models well enough to actually produce original tables. Beyond this, however, if you're teaching the arts in a medieval university, you've kind of got a problem. As we said earlier, there are two models of the cosmos you have in front of you, one by Aristotle and one by Ptolemy. The model by Aristotle is pretty understandable. Sure, it's kind of complicated with between 34 or 55 different spheres depending on which exact version you choose, but all of the spheres are centered on the Earth, and they all undergo uniform rotational motion. If you happen to be focused on work in natural philosophy, specifically physics, it all works with everything else Aristotle wrote. And when I say everything, I mean everything. One thing we sort of glossed over is that Aristotle's work created what we might call these days a theory of everything, with which one could understand all of the world. While there were certainly areas that were vague and places where you might disagree with some of the outcomes, there weren't any really obvious contradictions in any of Aristotle's work with any of the rest of Aristotle's work. Everything from his physics, to his cosmology, to his description of the stuff the world was made of, to his description of causes all fit together. The same was true for his logic and ontology and epistemology and ethics. Now, the reason it all fit together is that a lot of the descriptions were very broad and vague and hard to subject to testing. But if you look at the rise of scholasticism, one can sort of understand why that wasn't a problem. As a form of inquiry, the scholastic dialectic method was sort of just beginning to find itself and hit its stride as the plague got started. Men like Grosseteste, Bacon, and Occam were just beginning to lay out a set of true empirical methodologies that really went beyond the process of observation and experience to what we would think of as structured experimentation. These methods, of course, were based on the earlier writings by the Islamic scholars Al-Haytham and Ibn Sina. Aristotle's system, one based on his usually careful observation of the world around him, did a reasonable job of explaining what was seen and experienced, but it hadn't really been subjected to any sort of testing. Thus, in the years following his writing, whether that was in Hellenistic times or later here in the Latin Christian period, whenever things were tested, Aristotle's conclusions were actually shown to often be either inaccurate or incomplete. The best example of this could be looked at in the area of astronomy itself. We've kind of talked about it in our previous episodes. Later Hellenistic astronomers had shown that Aristotle's model couldn't actually produce the motions of the planets in the heavens, and so had kind of moved on. As we said in the episode titled Hellenistic Astronomy, men like Hipparchus abandoned his cosmology for a very different picture that did not adhere to all of the dictates of his celestial physics. Things like epicycles and an eccentric shift of the Earth's position off of the center of a planet's circular motion were introduced to bring the models more in line with the actual observed motions of the planets in the heavens. This process, of course, culminated in the works of Ptolemy, and he, of course, as we talked about, produced 4 works of some consequence, the most important of which was the Almagest. In it, he proposed something that just completely violated Aristotle's physics, something he called the equant, a point that the deferent of each planet was centered on, and the epicycle would appear to move with a constant velocity with respect to, but that was no longer the center of the circle. Now, if this is a bit confusing, we'll post a picture of this, and I'll see if I can find a link to a simulation to put on the podcast website, thescientificodyssey.typepad.com. This meant, of course, that uniform circular motion no longer described the epicycle's motion on the deferent, which was just a huge violation of one of Aristotle's main dictates about celestial motion. And this becomes a huge deal down the road, something we'll talk about in an episode in the future. And this was the other option, of course, for a Master of Arts faculty member who was trying to describe a cosmology of the heavens. One of the problems, as we said earlier, was that he probably didn't understand the Almagest very well. While there had been a couple of reasonably good translations of the work, Ptolemy's descriptions in math went way beyond anything he had likely seen before. Now, Ptolemy's contemporary readers, of course, had had the advantage of also having all of the material created by Hellenistic culture to buttress it. A lot of that material either hadn't survived the intervening centuries, such as was the case with the works of Apollonius the mathematician, who may have been the first to propose epicycles, or they hadn't been translated yet, or even if they had, that particular Master of Arts hadn't seen the translations. Even more importantly, though, Ptolemy's other 3 works on astronomy, including the one that gave a complete picture of his full model of the universe, actually hadn't made it to medieval Europe through the Islamic translation chain. So, to summarize, if you put yourself in the shoes of a faculty member, say, at the University of Paris, your choices are a description that fits well within a larger system that works to describe a lot of things, or an incomplete description you barely understand the fundamental pieces of that breaks all of the rules of the rest of the system you've come to work with. I wonder which one you're going to be likely to go with. Now, when the plague hits, everything kind of goes to pieces for a while. While it would be probably too much to say that an entire generation or two is stolen away, it is true that about half of that generation or two is stolen away. And as Dan Carlin asks in a couple of his hardcore history podcasts, one has to wonder about the psychological state of those who survive, especially in France, where the on-again, off-again 100 Years' War takes place during this time. How many of those who survived and might have attended the institutions of learning were prevented from doing so by things like post-traumatic stress disorder caused by having to watch half of your family die from this mysterious illness, and then having some marauding army come through your town, kill more of the inhabitants, and pillage what they could? While I can't find a source that explicitly says this, I imagine that many of the universities had their hands full just trying to keep enough faculty and students to stay open. And while there is clearly some work being done in the areas of natural philosophy and mathematics, it's pretty clear that there's a significant drop in output, especially in the harder hit areas of Southern Europe. And even when work is being done, it's often not well disseminated beyond the confines of whatever university the scholar was working at. Because of this, work was often lost or forgotten, sometimes for a couple of generations, sometimes for centuries. What seems to jumpstart things again are four factors. The first is the rediscovery of the poem De Rerum Natura by the Roman poet and philosopher Lucretius. It was rediscovered in 1417. The work put forward the atomistic view of Democritus and the Epicureans that we discussed in our series on the atom. The arguments for atomism were so striking that they reignited debate over the topic, something that brought the opinions of Aristotle into question for the first time in quite a while. So important was this discovery that some historians actually call this the beginning of the modern age. The next development is Gutenberg's movable type printing press. It's really hard to overestimate just how big a thing this will be. Not only did it speed up transmission of ideas and disentangle them from the person who first expressed them, which is the piece that's probably most important for historical purposes, it also, for the first time, made it possible to produce a large number of copies of a text in an error-free format in a way that was relatively inexpensive. Let me see if I can give you an example that will help you understand just how big a deal this is from another context. One of the old Protestant harangues against the Catholic Church, especially in England and Scotland, was that the Church kept the Bible out of the hands of the common person as a way of keeping power in the hands of its clergy. This was often symbolized by stories of Bibles being chained to pulpits or altars or locked away except on high holy days. Now this is actually true. Bibles were kept under lock and key, as it were, but it wasn't so that the clergy could keep them from the laity. The reason for this was that the process of producing a full Bible that was guaranteed to be a completely accurate copy in the age before the printing press was enormously expensive. Before the 12th century, the cost of materials was high, as either the Bible was constructed out of animal hides or paper made from old cloth. Added to that was the cost in man-hours of the copyists and proofreaders. While by the 14th century materials costs had diminished, the plague would rob that scriptorium culture of many of its scribes, resulting in few new copies actually being made. Thus, by the 15th century, Bibles were among the most valuable things in Europe. A man who could steal one and then sell it on the black market could live for years on the proceeds of his theft, assuming he could find someone willing to participate in such a heinous crime. So, in the same way, this is also true for good, accurate copies of the translations of major academic works, things like the works of Aristotle or the Almagest. With the invention of the printing press, knowledge could be made available, usually in error-free form, for a fraction of the cost, thus allowing for greater accessibility and collection in libraries. This will create an ability to study a complete text at nearly any place there's a university of any stature, rather than having to refer to an old set of handwritten notes from some master who'd once seen a copy of some other manuscript of a text. You kind of know what I mean here? In other words, this will advance academic discourse tremendously. Now, just as this is taking place, an event as seismic as any imaginable in Europe took place. In 1453, as we mentioned earlier, the walls of Constantinople were breached, and after a short period of intense fighting, the city fell. As the Ottoman Turks took the city and fully imposed their will across the area of Greece, Christian scholars began to pour into Europe, and with them came a huge number of manuscripts from Hellenic and Hellenistic traditions. Philosophers and mathematicians, previously known only through their Islamic commentators, or sometimes just not known at all, were now available in their original languages, as were scholars well versed in their study and interpretation. This will include a lot of works that will help scholars better understand Ptolemy. Finally, in that same year, the 100 Years' War came to a conclusion with the expulsion of the English from all of France, save Calais. With this, something approaching the modern nation of France and a true French identity came into being. Soon, similar consolidations would take place in places like Spain and Portugal. The upshot of all of this was a freeing up of the resources to invest in other priorities besides war. However, even as this was happening, the dual upheavals of the plague and the war had driven a number of scholars to take positions at newly forming institutions further east in Central and Northern Europe. As such, a number of these universities, most notably the University of Vienna, would become the place where the most innovative and imaginative voices would be heard, especially as England descended into the War of the Roses. So, before we jump into the outcomes of this, let's examine the kind of world that exists in the intellectual community. By the middle of the 15th century, the universities have recovered enough to begin producing new works. These works, however, come out of a specific mindset known as Aristotelianism in natural philosophy and Thomism, after the work of Thomas Aquinas, in theology. This is a system that is deeply committed to a worldview that has synthesized the Aristotelian system we've been talking about with a number of Christian theological positions in a way that had been first outlined in Aquinas' Summa Theologica. Discourse was now done in the disputations format, both in person and often in writing, with the former taking an almost trial-like formality, especially in the case of issues that had theological aspects to them. It's important to understand that as we go forward, this Aristotelianism will form the backdrop of everything that happens. In the academic world that the scientific revolution will play out in, the water through which everyone initially swam was the worldview undergirded by the teachings of three men: Aristotle, Augustine, and Aquinas. So let's pick up in the century following the plague's first two waves. As we mentioned earlier, going into the middle of the 14th century, astronomy was in something of a sorry state. While physics was well understood, and there was a great deal of academic discourse regarding it, some of which we discussed in the last episode, and some of which we'll discuss shortly, astronomy was still in a state where only very few could even begin to access the mathematical nuts and bolts of the various theories. As the 14th century turned to the 15th century, though, that began to change. First, for the natural philosophers studying physics, there was a pair of disputations taken up by a couple of familiar names, Jean Bourdon and Nicole Arisme. The fundamental question was about Aristotle's assertion that the Earth could not be rotating. Aristotle's reasoning for this was that if the Earth was rotating, then an arrow fired straight up into the air would not share that rotational motion, and so the Earth would turn from west to east underneath the arrow as it flew through the air. Given the size of the Earth, something Aristotle probably had an estimate of that was within a factor of 2 or so of the right answer, the Earth would travel some fairly large distance to the east with respect to the arrow, which of course was flying through the air. This would mean that the arrow should land far to the west of the archer. Thus, Aristotle concluded, since we don't observe this, the Earth can't be rotating. Now, Bourdon is the first to take up the question, and he makes two really important arguments. The first is to note that an observer can't really make a distinction between the case where the sphere of the stars was rotating one way, with the Earth being stationary, and the case where the sphere of the Earth is rotating in the other direction, with the sphere of the stars being stationary. He says that it's like two ships at sea. An observer on a ship, if he only has visual data to work with, can't really tell if it's the other ship that's moving with respect to him, or if it's really his ship that's moving with respect to the other ship. The second argument Buridan makes is something more in line with an argument Occam might have made using the law of parsimony. While neither motion could be distinguished from each other, it could be claimed that the motion wherein the Earth rotated would be a simpler thing to have happen. It would require less action by God to cause the much smaller sphere of the Earth to rotate than to cause the huge by comparison sphere of the stars to spin, not to mention all of the other spheres in Aristotle's model. Now from this, it would seem that Buridan was well on his way to making a very plausible case that it was just as likely, if not more so, that the Earth rotated on an axis rather than the heavenly spheres doing the moving, something that would contradict a fundamental point in Aristotle's cosmology. However, Buridan then went on to make a number of counter-arguments to this position. First, he noted that the terrestrial elements were markedly different than the celestial ether in that they possessed mass or weight, something he had used in his version of impetus theory. Hence, while it would seem to be simpler to move the Earth, that did not mean it was easier to move the Earth. With the other spheres made of the gossamer quintessence, and not subject to the changing of the terrestrial elements, once the heavenly spheres were set in motion, a task infinitely easier than setting the Earth to spinning, maintaining said motion in the absence of any resistance would also be infinitely easier. Buridan also made another argument. While it might be said that if the Earth and the air surrounding it were spinning, what would cause the arrow to travel in a path that would keep it directly above the archer in flight? Buridan used his impetus theory to argue that the upward impetus given to the arrow by the bow would be sufficient to resist at least some, if not most, of the moving air's influence, and thus the arrow would still land to the west of the archer. Again, something not observed. In light of these arguments, Buridan concluded that the Earth didn't rotate. Now, before we derisively shake our heads at Buridan's error in conclusion, I'd like us to take just a moment here to stop and really admire this guy's thinking. I mean, this is pretty darn impressive stuff if we dig down into it. He's taking the original assertion, unpacking it, considering its merits, and then finding them wanting. He looks at the arguments against the stationary Earth and gives them a fair hearing. He then builds new arguments using new physical ideas, and from those arguments comes to the same original conclusions, but for very different reasons. It's kind of brilliant work, actually. In my mind's eye, I can just see, his disputation session at the University of Paris, where, say, on Tuesday, he introduces Aristotle's argument and asks his older students to consider it. He then drops sort of like a few leading questions into the discussion that guide things towards a recognition that Aristotle might be in error, and that there are actually good arguments to be made that counter those. Just as the students, especially those who have finished the trivium, are trying to wrap their minds around this whole idea that maybe the Earth moves, he calls time to the session, marking the end of the class, and he sends them into the campus with ideas of a rotating Earth to try and work out, and try to figure out what it might all mean. Then on Thursday, he brings them back in to continue the disputation and has them consider some of the new ideas of motion, including impetus, being discussed by him and other scholars. I don't know if that's how it happened, but if it did, boy, does it make the teacher and me excited. Now, also here, to answer all the sociologists out there, yes, he's certainly come to the conclusion that reinforces his deep-seated biases. And I don't doubt for a minute that his experience of spending his whole life standing on solid ground with no personal sensation of motion had something to do with a subconscious desire to arrive at the outcome of a stationary Earth. But man, does he go a long ways to get there. And his thinking, I think, is just really excellent. More importantly, it opens the door for Arisme. Arisme, Buridan's colleague in Paris, has a slightly different view of impetus. Remember, It's an intriguing idea, but there's still a lot of debate about what it is and how exactly it works. From his view, Arisme asks, but what if the archer, while he's holding the arrow and moving with the spinning earth, were to impress some of the impetus on the arrow in the direction of the earth's rotation, so that, when it is fired, not only does the arrow have an upward impetus, but also a sideways impetus in the direction of the earth's motion? If that were the case, wouldn't the arrow look, to the archer anyway, to go straight up and then straight back down, when actually, from the view of a truly stationary observer, it would travel in an arc through space, starting from the bow and ending up back at the archer, who has moved some distance to the east due to the Earth's rotation? It's a devastatingly simple and yet brilliant argument. Can you imagine being in the room when the two masters disputed this? The idea gives me chills, to be honest. But, as we've already established on a number of occasions, I'm kind of a geek. Now, once Arisme's arguments gets written down and starts to circulate, it's recognized that there are no physical arguments that allow one to prefer a stationary Earth to a moving one. Also, an important note here is that Arisme never asserts that the Earth actually moves. He recognizes that he hasn't even begun to prove this sort of physical argument. All he is saying is that there's no physical observation that can be made that would allow an honest natural philosopher to determine between the two models. As a faithful Catholic, he asserts the position of his faith that the Earth is stationary in a development or deployment of the now commonplace, quote-unquote, naturally speaking strategy. As we will see, however, this will become super important in about 200 years. By the mid-1400s, astronomers in the universities are finally beginning to get a real handle on Ptolemy. They're beginning to master enough of the mathematics and work out enough of the model building that they can finally create their own physical models, things you can actually put your hands on. These things are called planetary equatoria. Now, while first produced in the 12th century, by the 15th century, the versions of these being produced in Europe went beyond being mere copies of Islamic tools to become something original based on an inherent understanding of what was in the Almagest. Also, by this point, as was mentioned earlier, the center of scholastic work in astronomy had shifted from Paris and England further east into Central Europe, as new institutions opened in the urban centers there that had not been as devastated by the plague and war. One such center was the University of Vienna, and it was there that a brilliant young man, Georg Peurbach, would show himself to be every bit Ptolemy's equal. Peurbach was a young prodigy trained in the humanities, but who also worked independently as a natural philosopher and astronomer. Working with Gerard of Cremona's translation of the Islamic version of the Almagest, he mastered the material well enough to clearly see the errors in the existing material being used to teach astronomy at the university, a curriculum that included the standard text of the time we discussed earlier, known as Theoria Planetarum, or Theory of the Planets. And it had been written, of course, before the plague by that unknown scholar. After receiving his Master of Arts in the same year as the Fall of Constantinople, 1453, Peurbach set out to give a series of lectures in the following year to correct the errors in the older work and offer a more complete set of pictures regarding a planetary theory that took seriously the model of Ptolemy. These lectures, based in part on Al-Hatham's On the Configuration of the World, were collected in manuscript form in 1454 and would immediately become enormously popular. Titled Theoriae Novae Planetarum, or New Theory of the Planets, it would be among the most read astronomical texts of the next 200 years. It would first be printed in 1472 and would have at least 56 editions, the most famous of which was the 1553 edition with an introduction and commentary written by the most respected humanist philosopher of the time, Erasmus Reinhold. It was almost certain that this would have been one of the texts from which Copernicus learned his astronomy. This, however, wouldn't actually be the biggest contribution to the field Peurbach would make. Upon receiving his master's, Peurbach was appointed court astronomer/astrologer in the retinue of the King Ladislaus V of Hungary, and then later the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III. This would soon bring him into contact with a really important person, but first there's another figure we need to introduce. In 1450, while Peurbach had been doing his master's work at Vienna, another gifted young student enrolled. Johann Muller was from the town of Königsberg in Bavaria, or literally, actually, it's called King's Mountain. That's what Königsberg means. And he had come to Vienna at the age of 11. Again, this is a kid starting university at the age of 11 to begin his study of the Trivium. Soon, he became a student of Peurbach's, initially assisting him with observations and calculations. It would be his notes from the 1454 lectures that Peurbach's new theory of the planets would be based. As he came into his own and began publishing his own work, he would change his name to something a lot more Latin sounding, as was the custom, and so hence he would become known as Johannes de Regiomonte, or later just Regiomontanus. In 1460, the two men came into contact with a very important figure at the time, Cardinal Johannes Bessarion. In my research, I've read that Bessarion was either Greek or from Constantinople or both, but he was one of the scholars who fled the fall of the last Roman city and was now an emissary of the Pope. On this occasion, he had been sent to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor on a diplomatic mission, and also kind of to drum up, see if there was any real support for an attempt to retake Constantinople. During his time there, he came into contact with Peurbach and expressed to the court astrologer his frustration and regret that there wasn't a good translation of Ptolemy's work from the original Greek. While Bessarion's diplomatic work was a mixed success, he did convince Peurbach to undertake a project to produce a better translation and commentary of the Almagest. Unfortunately, Peurbach died in 1461, just a year into the project, probably from one of the periodic outbreaks of the plague that still afflicted Europe. He did, however, on his deathbed, extract a promise from Regiomontanus to complete the work. To do this, the young astronomer accompanied Bessarion to Rome, where he learned Greek, studied the Almagest in even greater detail, and completed Peurbach's work in 1463. The resulting manuscript was titled An Epitome of the Almagest, and it represented the first time a European astronomer could rightly claim to stand as Ptolemy's equal. The work distilled and simplified Ptolemy's opus, often reworking complicated calculations using simpler and more understandable methods. It also did not shy away from criticizing Ptolemy's model, especially with respect to the fact that Ptolemy's model predicted that the apparent size of the moon in the night sky should, according to the epicycle-driven orbital dynamics, double its size throughout the month. While this problem had been commentated on by earlier Islamic scholars, there's no evidence that Regiomontanus knew of these, and thus his critique of the model on this point is the first known case of a European astronomer having a deep enough understanding of the work to be able to point out the places where it was in error. In 1471, just a few years before his untimely death, Regiomontanus would settle in Nuremberg and open the first printing press devoted to publishing scientific works. Now, other publishers shied away from these sorts of projects as they had a small audience and were often more complicated and expensive to produce due to the number of figures that had to be included, the difficulty of displaying mathematical operations, the abundance of tables, and the need for very careful proofreading by someone who could understand the nature of works. All of these things drove up the printing costs. The first book he would publish in 1472 was his old teacher's new theory on the planets. His second publication was the Ephemerides, a table of planetary positions for every day from 1465 to 1506, calculated from the models of the Epitome. As a point of note, it would be this set of tables that Columbus would take on his fourth journey to the New World. On January 29th of 1504, he would use the tables to predict an eclipse in order to coerce supplies for his starving crews from the understandably hostile natives of what would come to be called Jamaica. The Epitome itself would have to wait until 1496 to be published, and it too would become an enormously popular and influential work in the astronomical community that was rapidly growing, both in numbers and importance. Unfortunately, Regiomontanus would not live to see the printing of his masterwork. In 1476, he would follow his teacher's example in death, as he had done in life. At only the age of 40, the greatest mind of his generation would fall ill and die, again, probably due to the plague. In the years between the completion of the manuscript of the Epitome and his death, Regiomontanus had written to other scholars that he felt that there was something more fundamentally wrong with Ptolemy's model. There were too many loose ends, ad hoc devices, and unexplained coincidences for his taste, and he was sure that a major modification would be required. Unfortunately, his duties in Nuremberg had prevented him from doing more than tinker with a few ideas before the plague carried him beyond the concerns of charting the motions of the heavens. And thus, we are brought to the precipice of the 16th century, arguably the most tumultuous and consequential in bringing about the modern world. Unfortunately, we've gotten to the end of our time, and so we'll have to leave the story here at the dividing point, suspended between the end of the medieval world and the beginning of something born of new forces and technologies created in part by the Great Mortality. Next time, we'll look at the first of the great revolutions of the modern age, the one that applied to the heavens themselves. Thanks for taking the time to listen and for your continued support of the show. If you want to join the conversation, like our Facebook group and leave a comment about this or any other show. Also, if you can find a few moments, leave us a kind review on whatever service you use to listen. And if you want to make sure you get each new episode as we post it to the RSS feed, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Google Play Music, TuneIn, or Stitcher. Until next time, full sails on your journey.